Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name's Mary Lavin, and I'm currently chair of the history faculty for my evidently excessive sins of the past. This is a very special occasion to welcome you all to, on which we celebrate the foundation of the historical journal 100 years ago. 2023 to 24 turns out to be an annus mirabilis for the history faculty, and it's good to have something to be cheerful about these days. And tonight's lecture is the first of 3 anniversary events. On the 30th of January, Professor Michael Bentley will help us reflect on 150 years of the history degree programme, or historical tripos, as we insist on calling it, with a lecture on the peculiarities of Cambridge history. And on the 14th of May, Professor Ludmila Jordanova will address us on the occasion of the 300th anniversary of the Regis Chair. Her lecture is entitled The Monarch's History Men: What Has Changed Over 3 Centuries? And let's not forget about that all-important 75th anniversary of the admission to women as fellow undergraduates in 1948, a point of celebration for the entire university. So this really is a very remarkable year. We're very grateful to Amy Erickson and her anniversary committee for putting on this full programme, details of which can be found on our bespoke anniversaries webpage. Tonight, our thanks go to David Reynolds and Christ's College for hosting us, and to Cambridge University Press for supporting this lecture, and even more profoundly, for supporting the publication of our wonderful historical journal, a generalist periodical which presents on all aspects of British, European and world history since the 15th century, and which plays an especially important role in providing a forum for early career scholars making their debut. Thanks to the many historians within and beyond Cambridge who have served as editors, some of which are here today, and to all the members of the editorial board, past and present, and of course to all HJ authors. The lectures in this year's series will take the anniversary as their starting point only, but move out to consider the wider contexts in which historians do their work: publishing, education, scholarship. In this case, the anniversary of the historical journal provides a moment to consider the world of history writing and publishing, and who better to introduce this than Sir David Cannadine, who has made the history of history one of his many specialisms. Among his great books, I want to draw attention to his essays on history writing, The Pleasures of the Past, 1989, his thematic biography of one of the towering figures of history at Cambridge and in England as a whole, G.M. Trevelyan, A Life in History, 1992, History in Our Time, 1998, his editorship of the influential volume What is History Now, 2002, and with Nicholas Sheldon and Jenny Keating, The Right Kind of History, 2011, a history of history teaching in British schools. David holds this role as national historiographer alongside his many other writings on museums, the aristocracy, the monarchy, urban development, high finance, high politics, and much more. The list of David's publications is absolutely terrifying and overwhelming. His contributions to the infrastructure of the history profession go further still. David has served as director of the Institute of Historical Research, a commissioner of English Heritage, and chair of the famous Blue Plaques panel, chair of the trustees of the National Portrait Gallery, president of the British Academy, and among his many other roles is currently editor of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. David Cannadine has had the most distinguished and influential academic career on either side of the Atlantic, especially at Cambridge, Yale, and Princeton. He is, of course, a product of Clare, St John's, and Christ's colleges. All in all, he is the perfect person both to launch the Cambridge anniversaries and to unfold the history of history writing through the lens of the historical journal's centenary. He will speak tonight on who, how, and what for, publishing history in historical perspective. Welcome, David.
Mary, thank you so much for those immensely kind and generous remarks. Since, for the best part of half a century, I have earned my living by speaking as well as writing, I have become a connoisseur of introductions to myself. Not, it must be said, a fiercely competed for position. And I have never forgotten the occasion when I was on the road with my biography of Andrew Mellon and giving a talk in Kansas City. And the person in charge introduced me, and he said, I should like to introduce David Cannadine. He is the author of the greatest biography of Andrew Mellon ever written. And I rather preened myself at this point and thought the evening promised well. He then rather undercut things by saying, it is, of course, the only biography of... So, Mary, thank you not only for the kind things that you said, but for not having said that. It's an enormous privilege and pleasure to be here to give the first of these anniversary lectures and to find myself, therefore, in the company of Michael Bentley, who writes the most bracing reviews of my books and who, as we all know, is the self-appointed representative of the late Herbert Butterfield here on Earth. And also Ludmilla Jordanova, with whom I spent many happy hours trying to run the National Portrait Gallery. In speaking about one of the foremost academic periodicals in the Anglophone world, I cannot resist the temptation to begin by reminding you that the most famous scholarly article never published in English, in the historical journal or anywhere else, was Jim Dixon's disquisition on the economic influence of the developments in shipbuilding techniques 1450 to 1485, which first came to public notice in 1954 when Kingsley Amis published Lucky Jim. It was, Amis makes Dixon muse, a perfect title in that it crystallized the article's niggling mindlessness, its funereal parade of yawn-enforcing facts, the pseudo-light it threw upon non-problems. Dixon had read, the text goes on, or begun to read dozens like it, but his own seemed worse than most in its air of being convinced of its own usefulness and significance. In considering this strangely neglected topic, the article began. This what neglected topic? This strangely what topic? This strangely neglected what? His thinking all this without having defiled and set fire to the typescript only made him appear to himself as a hypocrite and a fool. Yet in some ways, of course, Amis's joke tells against himself, for across the intervening decades, and as some historians have pointed out, the subsequent production of a growing number of much narrower articles than this means Dixon's piece now may be taken as appearing impressively wide-ranging in its ambition and almost irresponsibly audacious in its scope. To set against this, I vividly recall Geoffrey Elton, of whom more later, once observing that he believed that the true test of the continuing credibility and commitment of historians was whether or not they kept on publishing articles. Although I think there are many other yardsticks by which to assess and evaluate what we do, he undoubtedly had and still has a point. They may be easily mocked, as of course I have just suggested, but academic articles remain in essential and significant ways the fundamental bedrock of our scholarly activity. As it happens, and as Mary has mentioned, the first such pieces I ever got into print were in the historical journal, and that has been true of many other scholars too, of whom again more later. Having subsequently been recruited to the editorial board of Past and Present, I refereed somewhere between 10 and 20 submissions annually for the best part of 40 years, while publishing a few pieces of my own in that journal as well. For quite a while, I wrote the Survey of Periodical Literature for the Urban History Yearbook, and as director of the Institute of Historical Research, I edited its in-house publication, by then known as Historical Research, where I also appeared in print. So while I suppose it's fair to say that I have practiced history in other modes and written books aimed at a broader audience, I remain of the view that articles matter, and I have a particular fondness for the historical journal because that is where I started out about 50 years ago, and that's another reason why I'm delighted to have the opportunity to help celebrate its centenary this afternoon. I want to begin the substance of my remarks somewhat earlier than 1923, in the 1880s and 1890s, which provide the essential prehistory for understanding the genesis of the Cambridge Historical Journal. Both decades, and indeed the years up to the outbreak of the First World War, were characterised by a growing interest in the national past, one aspect of which was what has been described as the burgeoning cult of commemoration, marking anniversaries, centenaries, and royal jubilees. Among them, the centenary of Gibbon's death in 1894, the 100th anniversary of Trafalgar and the death of Nelson in 1905, and the two jubilees of Queen Victoria in 1887 and 1897. This, as one contemporary put it, present rage for centenaries and for other anniversaries, was also accompanied by what another contemporary observed as the rise of pageant fever, dramatic representations of particular episodes in the history of a community or an organisation, usually again commemorating significant anniversaries and involving a great deal of dressing up, articulating various notions of history, identity, and very often invented traditions in places such as Sherborne, Oxford, Dover, Colchester, Bath, and St Albans. The decades either side of 1900 also witnessed the creation of the National Trust, the Victoria Histories of the Counties of England, the Survey of London, and the Royal Commission on Historical Manuscripts, preservationist societies, and proselytising organisations, all of which were concerned, in one way or another, with what we would now call public history, as of course was the Dictionary of National Biography, completed on time in 63 volumes, published between 1885 and the end of the 19th century. Behind these many and varied initiatives lay the powerful Victorian inheritance of such writers as Lord Macaulay, J.A. Froude, Thomas Carlyle, J.R. Green, and S.R. Gardner, who wrote narrative national histories aimed at a wide general audience. And that reading public became much broader following the passing of Forster's Education Act of 1870 and the expansion of public schools and grammar schools during the last quarter of the 19th century. At the same time, degree courses in history had recently been established at Oxford, 1872, Cambridge, 1874, in the Scottish universities and on the new red brick campuses of Leeds, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, and Sheffield. Here was a new, young, enlarged audience for history, for whom publishers such as Methuen, Longmans, and Macmillan created multi-authored textbook series and general surveys. Underlying this increased public appetite for history and increased public provision of history was the growing belief that a knowledge of the national past was essential, not only to help ensure that the expanding electorate would behave responsibly when it came to vote, but also to train those statesmen governing the United Kingdom and ruling the rapidly expanding empire. Thus was history instantiated as a significant component of late Victorian public culture and Edwardian national life. But what about history as an academic profession, as distinct from being an essentially amateur activity of the sort I've just described? Once again, in Britain, the period from the 1880s to the First World War was transformative when, as one authority later put it, British historians appear to have discovered the joys of scholarly communication and association. I think joy may perhaps be overdoing it a bit, but in essence, that observation is correct. By the late 19th century, history had become a more professionalised activity and scholarly discipline in universities on parts of continental Europe and in the United States, more so indeed than in the United Kingdom. In Germany, Rankian scientific history was much more rigorous than anything that was happening here, while the American Historical Association, representing all professional practitioners, had been founded in 1885. Only gradually did Britain begin to catch up, thanks to the endeavours of such figures as Stubbs, Freeman and Firth in London, Acton, Maitland and Bury here in Cambridge, Prothero and Pollard in London, and Trout and Ward in Manchester. Seeking to emulate the German way of doing things, these historians were eager to work on primary sources. They concentrated on medieval and early modern history. They were especially interested in constitutional and ecclesiastical subjects. They liked producing translated and edited texts, and they wanted to train their own graduate students in their own image. One area in which some of them became active was the Royal Historical Society, which had been founded in 1868 for the conducting of historical, biographical and ethnological investigations. During its first 30 years, qualifications for membership were minimal, and in 1889 Bishop Crichton described the Royal Historical Society as a vast fraud where a number of old fogies air their fads. Only in 1889 was a historian of genuine distinction elected as President Adolphus Ward of Manchester, and he would later be followed by Firth and Tout, a sure sign that the professionals were beginning to prevail over the amateurs. The professionals also recognised that if history was to become a serious subject in universities at both undergraduate and graduate levels, it had to be better promoted, first of all, in the classroom. Hence the creation of the Historical Association in 1906, largely thanks to the initiative of Firth, Tout and Pollard to coordinate the efforts of all who are working in England towards the improvement of history teaching in our schools. Firth was the first president, and he was followed by both Tout and Pollard. These were two very significant initiatives. Less successful before the First World War were attempts by Pollard and others to create a school of advanced historical studies based at the University of London, which would have trained graduate students as in Germany and the United States. But because of lack of funding, nothing happened. Nevertheless, there was some degree of growing professionalisation. One further indication of which was the appearance of the first British historical journals. Germany and France had been pioneers with the Historical Zeitschrift in 1859 and the Revue Historique in 1876. The Royal Historical Society had begun to publish its transactions in 1872, but the early volumes appeared only intermittently, and their contents were at best more antiquarian than scholarly. Only since 1888 have the transactions been published continually on an annual basis, except for 1938. And by the early 20th century, they had become the recognisably professional and academic publications that we see today. As so often, the 1880s were a crucial decade, for they also witnessed the creation of the English Historical Review in 1886. Like the transactions of the Royal Historical Society, the English Historical Review also made a faltering start, beset by financial uncertainty and unclear as to whether it should be just another literary London periodical or an innovative scholarly publication. But by the 1900s, it too had become fully established as a serious academic production which could hold its own against the American Historical Review that had been established in 1895. In 1916, the Historical Association acquired its own quarterly journal, History, initially edited by the ubiquitous Pollard. Originally intended for history teachers rather than university-based historians, it too would eventually evolve into a more scholarly publication. Well, I realise that the Cambridge Historical Journal, to say nothing of the Historical Journal, its successor, has yet to make its first substantive appearance in these remarks. But context and perspective can be as much about antecedents as about contemporaneity. And the gradually evolving professional milieu and scholarly infrastructure that I have just described is essential to understanding the origin of the journal. That's what it came out of. The more immediate context was provided by a cluster of scholarly innovations soon after the end of the First World War. In 1921, thanks to the energy of Pollard and the generosity of Sir John Cecil Power, a modified version of the abortive School of Advanced Historical Studies was eventually realised in the form of the Institute of Historical Research, of which Pollard became the first director, with the aim of providing the rigorous, source-based historical training in London for graduate students that was not available at any other British university. In 1923, Pollard produced the Institute's first bulletin, and in his introductory editorial, he took pains to stress that it would not compete with existing history periodicals. On the contrary, he insisted that its prime purpose was to provide a record of the work done at the Institute. Hence the first articles on such subjects as editing historical documents, acquisitions at the Public Record Office, training in historical research, and summaries of theses for the MA degree. Was it coincidence that in the same year, 1923, the Cambridge Historical Journal also first appeared? I have to say I don't know, but it is nevertheless an interesting coincidence. The editorial committee consisted of E.A. Benions, Z.N. Brooke, J.H. Clapham, and J. Holland Rose. They were all men. They were all based in Cambridge. Their areas of interest extended from the medieval world to modern Europe and the British Empire, and the moving spirit behind the journal's creation was Howard Temperley, who was its first editor. He was a fellow of Peterhouse, a university reader in modern history, and a historian of 19th century British foreign policy and diplomacy. In 1916, he'd been seconded to the War Office, where for 6 years he served as an advisor on Balkan affairs. And it was following his return to academe, and also in the aftermath of the death of his wife, which meant he was looking for more things to do, that he founded the Cambridge Historical Journal. Like the Bulletin of the Institute of Historical Research, its initial instalments were relatively slight, appearing only once a year. And it was not until 1925 that they were consolidated into the first volume. The articles in the first numbers addressed topics as varied as the Emperor Diocletian, Italian medieval history, and 19th and 20th century diplomacy and foreign policy, the latter, of course, much pushed by Temperley himself. While the notes and communication section included reports on plea rolls of the medieval county courts and notes on modern diplomatic, colonial and other records at present available for study in Cambridge. From the mid-1920s to the late 1950s, this remained the Cambridge Historical Journal's basic formula, although there were some changes along the way. Beginning in 1927, it included advertisements for its sister journals, History, the English Historical Review, and the Bulletin of the Institute of Historical Research. For editions of the British and foreign state papers, published by Her Majesty's Stationery Office, for Cambridge University Press, for Foyle's Bookshop in London, and for Bowes and Bowes store here in Cambridge. In 1928, G.M. Trevelyan, who had recently been appointed Regius Professor of Modern History here in Cambridge, joined the editorial committee on which he would sit until 1952, and I think every one of his successors has in turn sat on the committee or the editorial board. And the journal published its first list of Cambridge students working for the M.Lit and PhD degrees in history, of whom there were then 22. And which would be updated in the journal every year until 1955. In 1936, Temperley's protégé, Herbert Butterfield, and another fellow of Peterhouse, who also believed that diplomatic history was the highest form of doing history, became the journal's acting editor, formally taking over 2 years later. In 1938, Helen Cam became the first woman to join the editorial committee. There would not be another for a very long time, in fact 60 years. And the following year, Temperley died, the only figure associated with the journal to receive an obituary in the journal, where he was mourned as the epitome of Cambridge history. This was self-evidently very much a Cambridge-based operation, and the journal was filled almost exclusively with Cambridge-based historians. In 1931, G.M. Trevelyan, with John Richards, published Peterborough and Barcelona 1705, Narrative and Diary of Colonel John Richards, an edited text with commentary which was a byproduct of Trevelyan's multi-volume England under Queen Anne and the only piece he ever published in the Cambridge Historical Journal. The same year, another much younger Trinity Fellow and fellow Northumbrian, Stephen Runciman, appeared in the journal's pages for the first and also, like Trevelyan, for the last time as well. Among Runciman's near contemporaries, also making their first appearance in print, were such later luminaries as J.H. Plum, Philip Grierson, John Saltmarsh, and Betty Behrens. And they were followed after 1945 by what was then the younger generation of Asa Briggs, Walter Ullman, Christopher Brooke, G.R. Elton, J.G.A. Pocock, J.H. Eliot, J.P. Kenyon, and Peter Laslett. The journal's chronological range remained wide, but the subjects it published were confined, principally government, politics and the state, foreign policy and international relations, with an occasional dash of political thought added in. And they all focused overwhelmingly on the United Kingdom and Europe. Marxists such as Christopher Hill and Eric Hobsbawm or Rodney Hilton were conspicuous by their absence, and there was nothing published in the journal to match the vitriolic exchanges that characterised the storm over the gentry and the controversy over the standard of living in the Industrial Revolution that were hosted in the Economic History Review, or the wide-ranging speculations in the pages of Past and Present on the alleged general crisis of the 17th century. The early issues of the journal had been thin. They became even more emaciated during the Second World War, and it was only during the mid-1950s that 2 issues a year, together amounting to 200 pages, were published. In 1953, Patrick Bury succeeded Herbert Butterfield as editor, and 3 years later, J.H. Plum joined the editorial committee. 1956 also witnessed 2 further changes. The list of Cambridge research students working for higher degrees had been dropped and never reappeared, and review articles and book reviews appeared in the journal's pages for the first time. And in the second issue for 1957, this brief but portentous editorial note appeared. In pursuit of their policy of giving the Cambridge Historical Journal a wider national character with special emphasis on modern history, the editorial committee have decided that the word Cambridge should be omitted from the title. Beginning with the first number for 1958, it will therefore henceforth be published as the Historical Journal. At the same time, although this was not explicitly stated, the journal ceased to publish articles on the ancient and medieval world to focus entirely on the centuries after 1500. It doesn't altogether seem obvious on what basis that decision was made, but for whatever reason, this actually meant that a new era of expansion was about to begin. But, although Cambridge had been removed from the title, the journal would remain in many ways a local, in-house Cambridge production. The first phase of the journal's history, extending from 1923 to 1956, lasted for exactly 1/3 of the century we are marking and celebrating today. The second phase, to which I shall now turn, extended from 1957 until 1994. And its two defining characteristics, the one structural, the other individual, were the unprecedented growth in the size of the journal and the dominance of Geoffrey Elton on its editorial committee. Behind the first of these transformations lay the massive expansion in higher education that took place in Britain following the recommendations made in the Robbins Report published in 1964. Thereafter, Oxbridge, London University, and the Civic Red Bricks all upscaled and expanded, and they were joined by a new generation of universities, among them Sussex, Kent, York, Lancaster, and East Anglia, all with strong history departments, often teaching the subject in innovative and interdisciplinary ways. In 1950, less than 500 academics were employed in British higher education teaching history. By 1980, the number had exploded to 2,000, and by 2000 it would reach 3,000. As a result, more university-based historians were teaching, researching, and writing history than ever before. And they were publishing more than ever before, and not only in book form, but in article form as well. And that's the underpinning for the explosion in journals in the 1960s and 70s. This meant that this enhanced number of historians were writing articles in unprecedented quantities and publishing them in an unprecedented number of journals, including, of course, what was now the Historical Journal. It began to fill out during the late 1950s. From the early 1960s, its growth accelerated, and by the late 1970s, the journal had expanded to 4 issues a year, which together amounted to more than 1,000 pages. A veritable publishing explosion, and to a level that has been maintained pretty well ever since. This was expansion on a similar scale to the increases in the number of historians working in British universities. And this in turn meant that more articles were being submitted by historians who were now working in a wider range of locations and institutions. While Temperley and Butterfield had been in charge, contributions to the journal had been overwhelmingly from scholars based in the Golden Triangle of Oxford, Cambridge, and London, and especially, above all, from Cambridge itself. But by the 1960s, they were increasingly to be located elsewhere in the United Kingdom and also in the United States and sometimes even in continental Europe. To take but one example, the first journal issued in 1983 published authors from York and Edinburgh universities, the University of Wales at Aberystwyth, Odense University in Denmark, and Mississippi State University and the University of Missouri-Columbia, both situated across the Atlantic. Thus was the historical journal not only nationalised, as had been hoped when the word Cambridge had been dropped from the masthead in 1957, but also in some ways internationalised too. Yet this change had its limits, for it did not bring with it a noticeable widening in the geographical range of the articles that were published, which remained preponderantly British and European, and as before they were often concerned with the state and high politics, with diplomatic relations and foreign policy, and with political thought. And it's scarcely coincidental that these areas of inclusion aligned with the areas of interest of such journal editors as F.H. Hinsley, Professor of International Relations at Cambridge and an expert on 19th and early 20th century foreign policy, and Derek Beales, Professor of Modern History in the same university, who wrote on Britain, Italy and Austria across the 18th and 19th centuries. Most of the articles the journal published were also essentially monographic, concerned with a specific place within a relatively narrow time frame. And occasional wide-ranging pieces, such as Donald Coleman on mercantilism and Theodore K. Rabb on the expansion of Europe and the spirit of capitalism, were very much the exceptions that proved the rule. The all-male dominance of Cambridge historians also remained entrenched. Bright, young Cambridge-based scholars still got disproportionately into print in the journal's pages, among them Simon Sharma, Roy Porter, John Brewer, Noel Malcolm, Jonathan Parry, Peter Lake and Lawrence Goldman, Linda Colley being a very rare female exception. Throughout the second phase of its existence, the journal's editors were invariably based in Cambridge, and so were members of the editorial committee, of whom the most influential was Geoffrey Elton. This was partly because he was involved with the journal for so long, succeeding J.H. Plum on its editorial committee, and there must surely be an interesting story about that, of which he was a member for 33 years. And as anyone who sat with him around the same table will attest and recall, Elton was never a quiet or compliant committee man. It was also because he published more pieces in the journal than anyone else before or since. 10 articles and 30 book reviews, and they were often combative and controversial. He quarrelled with J.P. Cooper over the last years of Henry VII's reign and got distinctly the better of the exchange, noting en passant of his adversary that a self-appointed hound of heaven should be more precise in his quest. And in a withering review, Elton denounced Lawrence Stone's Causes of the English Revolution as a modish but unconvincing updating of the traditional Whiggish account, and called for an entirely new approach to explaining the outbreak of the Civil War, free from the distorting perspective of hindsight. And in so doing, he fired the opening salvo of what would soon become the revisionist revolution, much of which was subsequently published in the Historical Journal. Formidable though they both undoubtedly were, there was more to Elton's influence on the journal than his personality and his publications. The one major controversy it hosted during the 1960s was concerned with debating the causes and describing the nature of the so-called 19th century revolution in government, a top-down intervention by enlightened bureaucrats that bore a more than passing resemblance to the Tudor Revolution in government that Elton insisted had taken place in England 300 years before. And Stone's Causes of the English Revolution was not the only modish work of the 1960s and 1970s to be severely reviewed and rebuked in the journal's pages. In a memorable sentence, Geoffrey Best rightly criticised E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class for neglecting what he described as the flag-saluting, foreigner-hating, peer-respecting side of the plebeian mind. Robert Bedard was distinctly unimpressed by J.H. Plum's efforts in the growth of political stability in England to link together economic, social and political change and to claim they were all moving in the same inexorable direction. And Michael Oakeshott was decidedly sniffy about Quentin Skinner's Foundations of Modern Political Thought, which he regarded as another mistaken exercise in the sort of anachronistic and secular teleology against which Elton too had unwaveringly set his face. But influential though he unquestionably was, Elton did not always get his own way, even in the pages of his own in-house journal. In one review, Joel Hurstfield regretted that in the volume of the new Cambridge Modern History on the Reformation, Elton as editor had failed to discipline and rein in Elton as a contributor. In another review, Betty Behrens wrote a notice on the practice of history, expressing her disappointment and dismay that Elton's notion of the historian was not as an intellectual, but as a technician, which was, she thought, one of the most extraordinary claims to be put forward in the 20th century in defence of a major subject of humane study. Interestingly enough, at that time, Betty Behrens was married to E.H. Carr, and his book, What is History?, had been Elton's prime target in his own later publication. The pages of the journal also bear witness to the sad decline in Elton's relations with his former research student, David Starkey, who turned on Elton with perhaps an even greater ferocity than Elton had earlier on turned on his former mentor, Sir John Neale. In one review of a critical book about Elton that Starkey had edited, Elton deplored his sharp and discourteous tone, which he hoped excused my inability to take his attack lying down. In reply to another equally hostile review, Starkey retorted by denouncing Elton for pure bullying, for making assertions laced with error, and for falling into absurdity. Uncharacteristically, Elton did not reply, but he continued to pay off scores against Lawrence Stone. In another review, he opined that Stone had produced a series of very large books using successive social science techniques, which erected great structures that tended to collapse as soon as they were closely examined. In the December issue of 1993, Elton insisted that Muriel Sinclair Burns' edition of the Lyell Letters did not show, which Stone claimed they did, that Cromwell was excessively corrupt. Stone's review, Elton went on, revealed a determined hatred of Cromwell, which, alas, reflects his disapproval of me. It was Elton's last appearance in the Historical Journal. He died the following year, and with his passing, the second phase in its history ended. For Elton, then, the Historical Journal was, among other things, the vehicle through which he pursued some of his unforgiving intellectual vendettas. But by the time of his death, changes were already occurring in the broader historical landscape and at the journal itself that anticipated the third phase of existence, and which are still in train and in process today, in terms of gender, geography, and globalisation. In 1990, Barbara Harris published Women and Politics in Early Tudor England. And 3 years later, Amanda Vickery authored Golden Age to Separate Spheres, two pioneering pieces intruding subjects into the journal that up to then had received decidedly short shrift. In 1991, it was announced that in addition to the Cambridge members of the editorial committee, there would henceforward also be American members of the editorial committee, beginning with Geoffrey Parker and Harold James. It was a significant international innovation, but also a revealing and parochial indication of what equivalence meant. The University of Cambridge on one side, the whole of the United States represented by two people on the other. And in 1995, soon after Elton's death, Christopher Bailey, already the doyen of South Asian historians, was brought onto the editorial committee. the first scholar whose interests were outside Britain and extended beyond Europe. This cluster of changes and innovations was not only intrinsically significant, but also a portent of the shape of things to come in the third phase of the journal's history, to which I shall now turn. To be sure, and as always, some things have not changed. Many of the articles that have appeared since 1995 remain concerned with what might be termed traditional and conventional subjects: high politics, governance, the state, international relations, foreign affairs and political thought that might have been published in the journal at any time in its history. And many young scholars have still been getting into print for the first time in its pages. Among them Mark Mazower, Catherine Merridale, Alex Walsham, Paul Redman, Abigail Green, Julian Hoppit, Helen McCarthy, Annabel Brett and Harriet Lyon. But as those names suggest, there was a great deal of change amidst apparent continuity, for there were many more women making their way into the journal at the beginning of their careers, and some of them were not even based in Cambridge. This may help explain why articles were being published on subjects that would not have appeared in the journal in earlier phases of its history. In 2003, for example, in one issue alone, offerings included deafness in early modern England, family portraits at Kedleston, mass culture and the re-enchantment of modernity, metropolitan women police and child welfare, and the civil rights movement in America and the Vietnam War. Any one of those contributions could have been accepted by, for example, past and present with equal plausibility. A further indication of these new directions was that, as far as I've been able to find out, the word sex first appeared in the title of an article in the 2000 issue. And having broken that taboo, it appeared twice in 2001. Things were clearly hotting up, and bodies, sexuality, homosexual and pornography soon followed. Underlying these changes were three developments so significant that the journal both had to take notice of them and, in its own turn and on its own terms, help promote them. The growing number of women in the profession, the ever-widening range of subjects that history was embracing, and the increasing globalization of the academic world. In 1998, Karen Kupperman joined the editorial committee. She was the first woman since Helen Cam 60 years before. She was also an American who was based at New York University and who worked on, among other things, indigenous peoples. There were further changes in 2001. Two more women came onto what was now described as the editorial board, University of Cambridge, Sheila Ogilvie and Betty Wood. At the same time, an international advisory board was constituted, with members from universities elsewhere in Britain and from Ireland, France, Germany, and the United States. Of the 14 members, 6 were women. One further change at this time also merits attention, and that was the way in which members of the editorial were described, as the previous elaborate paraphernalia of titles, initials, honours, and post-nominals were dispensed with. Thus, for example, Professor D.E.D. Beals, Lit D, FBA, was reimagined and repurposed as Derek Beals. And Professor Q.R.D. Skinner, FBA, was reincarnated and re-identified as Quentin Skinner. Rumour has it that as an undergraduate, he was even known as Bob Skinner, but that was a very long time ago. These changes, by turns reactive to wider developments, but locally proactive in response, have continued ever since, along with some specific particularities. In 2007, the journal marked the 50th anniversary of dropping the Cambridge part of its title with an unusually ostentatious front cover, followed a year later by Mark Goldie's marvellous retrospective of that half-century and the appointment of Claire Jackson as the first ever female editor of the journal. In 2013, Sujit Sivasandararam joined the editorial board and 3 years later became one of the editors, a further recognition of history's diversity and of the journal's growing inclusiveness. Another indication of which was that by then, of the 15 members of the editorial board, a majority for the first time were women. Today, the editors are Rachel Lowe, based here in Cambridge, but only the second woman to share the editorial chair, of Malaysian origin and an expert in modern Southeast Asian history, and her co-editor, John Gallagher, who specialises in early modern British and European cultural and social history, but who is based at Leeds University, I think the first editor of the journal not to be based here in Cambridge. The world changes, history changes, Cambridge changes, academic publishing changes, and so eventually does the journal as well. Such then, briefly, is the third phase of the journal's century-long development. Let me now try to set its own particular history in the broader setting of periodical publications in history across those 100 years. In 1923, the Cambridge Historical Journal was one of only a very few such periodicals. But by 2023, it was merely one among very many periodicals. But it wasn't immediately obvious that that was necessarily the direction in which things would be going. In 1926, the Economic History Review was launched, just 3 years after the Cambridge Historical Journal. And in the early 1950s, Past and Present first appeared on the scene. But for the time being, and leaving aside the Scottish Historical Review, Irish Historical Studies, and the Welsh History Review, which most English historians, to their shame, tended to ignore, that was just about it. And I vividly recall Lawrence Stone once telling me that in the early 1960s, as he'd always done as a Fellow of Wadham, and before he departed to Princeton, he would spend a few days at the end of every summer in the Upper Bodleian Library, reading the recent issues of the English Historical Review, History, the Historical Journal, the Economic History Review, and Past and Present, which was all he needed to do to keep up with all the new work published in historical periodicals in the United Kingdom. There weren't, he thought, any more that mattered. But from the 1960s onward, there was, has been, still is, a veritable explosion in the quantity of academic periodicals devoted to the past. For as the number of historians employed in universities in the United Kingdom, and I think even more so in the United States, expanded, this led in turn to a massive proliferation of increasingly specialised historical periodicals, devoted to, among other things, the histories of individual European countries, to the many different aspects of North American history, to the world beyond the West, encompassing Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, and to new methodological and subdisciplinary approaches in, for example, social history, women's history, black history, cultural history, demographic history, world history, and global history, as well as the history of international relations, the history of childhood, the history of political thought, the history of medicine, the history of war, the history of sexuality, and so on. The proliferation, and as some deplore, the fragmentation of our discipline, has been accompanied by a corresponding proliferation and expansion of historical journals. And one reason why so many of these new subfields have been underrepresented in the historical journal is that they have from the beginning had their own specialised publications. Put another way, it is much harder for the journal to continue to aspire to universal coverage because the universe to be covered is now impossibly enormous. Many of these new journals have produced manifestos, beginning with the Economic History Review, which unsurprisingly sought to argue the importance of the economic approach to the past. The first issue of Past and Present insisted that it is to history that the great majority of thinking men and women look for strength and understanding, And it went on, it was to them that we address ourselves. The opening editorials of the History Workshop Journal were even more insistent. Its purpose, the editorial collective claimed in 1976, was to make history a more democratic activity and a more urgent concern, in the belief that it was too important to be left to the professional historians. Interestingly, all three of these journals later adjusted their titles. In 1956, Past and Present explicitly abandoned its claim to be a journal of scientific history and implicitly gave up on the aspiration to appeal to the great majority of thinking men and women. In 1995, the History Workshop Journal withdrew its subtitle, claiming that it was a journal of feminist and socialist history, on the grounds, and I quote, that some scholars were uncomfortable labelling their scholarship in those ways. By then, the Economic History Review had added a subtitle, insisting it was a journal of economic and social history, which was not how it had started out and never really what it's quite become. By contrast, the Historical Journal has repeatedly refrained from issuing any such manifesto, which means it's never had to modify it in any way. Instead, its website now proclaims that it publishes articles on all aspects of British, European and world history since the 15th century. The aspiration to universal coverage remains. There's not very much comparative data that's been provided by other journals, but some interesting conclusions may nevertheless be drawn. Like the Economic History Review and Past and Present, the Historical Journal remains overwhelmingly strong on Britain and to a lesser extent on Europe. That has always been true, despite some long-term interest in imperial history and more recently in global history. Like other journals, it's given particular attention to the 16th and 17th centuries, rather less to the 18th, a great deal to the 19th in the 1950s and 60s, but in recent times much more to the 20th century, as this has become a serious period of historical study. The recent gender balance of contributors is better than the Economic History Review, but not so good as History Workshop, Past and Present, or the American Historical Review. Perhaps this is because many of what remain the journal's traditional staple subjects, high politics, government, the state, international relations and political thought, are more attractive to male scholars, whereas subjects that often appeal to women, gender, sexuality, culture, leisure, the family, have their own specialist publications. All this is but another way of saying that the recent establishment of a majority of women on the journal's editorial board has yet to be reflected in the gender balance of its articles. Let me come to some conclusions here. As Mark Goldie warned in his article on the 50th anniversary retrospective of the Historical Journal, any attempt at commemoration runs the risk of complacency. And as I draw these remarks to a close, I'm eager to stress that I want to avoid doing that. Beyond doubt, the Historical Journal has published and continues to publish much interesting and important work. And in certain fields, such as international relations, Tudor history, 17th century revisionism, 20th century Germany and political thought, some articles have undeniably been innovative and path-breaking. And the more diverse, globally connected and electronically accessible historical journal that has recently evolved is not a publication that Temperley or Butterfield would altogether have recognised or appreciated. Such is one version of the narrative arc that both separates but also links the fledgling Cambridge Historical Journal of 1923 with the long since well-established Historical Journal of 2023. Yet there are also many significant continuities, since many articles remain precisely posed exercises in the sort of technical history that Geoffrey Elton thought was the only way history should be done. Maybe he was right, or there again, maybe he wasn't. It also seems to be the case that the editors have been less proactive in soliciting articles or in encouraging debates than their counterparts in some other journals. With something like 100 unsolicited submissions each year, it's easy to understand that dealing with them is more than enough to be going on with. but perhaps a little more editorial initiative in that area, which I suspect is already displayed in commissioning historiographical reviews and review articles, might be no bad thing. I'm also eager, finally, to admit that the account I have given here of the evolution of the Cambridge Historical Journal into the Historical Journal is only one of many possible and potential commemorative histories. Who, if anyone, chairs the editorial board? How are board members chosen? What happens at their meetings? We know quite a lot about the articles that are accepted, but what about those that are turned down? How are difficult editorial decisions reached, handled, and implemented? What have been the relations between the journal and the Cambridge Historical Society and with Cambridge University Press? How have subscription patterns altered over time, especially geographically? What has been the impact of the RAE, the REF, and the IT revolution and moves to open access? Has the journal made any impact beyond the world of academic university-based history? These are all important questions, but they are perforce beyond the scope of my lecture this afternoon. Yet whatever these alternative histories might reveal, they would surely serve to reinforce the case that I hope I have made here, that the Historical Journal has long since become a permanent feature and significant part of the scholarly and academic landscape. History, as E.H. Carr once observed, is an unending dialogue between the past and the present. And whatever, like all journals, its limitations, the Historical Journal has played a most important part in facilitating and sustaining that essential conversation for over 100 years. Long may it continue to do so, and may there be many more issues and many more articles still to come. Thank you.